I'm Kevin Sabet, and thanks for taking a little bit of time to hear me out. I'm going to speak for the next 10 to 12 minutes about a balanced approach to marijuana policy, which essentially answers no to the question of legalization, but yes to the question of balance. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience of legal drugs in society, the experience of legalization elsewhere, the underground market related to marijuana, the latest marijuana health effects, and I'll conclude with a bit on medical marijuana. You know, unfortunately, we're often tied into the point where we have to decide between either legalization or full prohibition. That's the way the debate has often been presented. And I think that presenting the debate in that way is too simplistic for what it actually is, when we know that it's really a balanced approach of programs that work. A couple of things to start as a premise. First, it's very interesting to look at the polls for marijuana legalization. And actually, we're at a point now in 2010, 2012, where we've never had so much support for marijuana legalization from the general public, according to a couple of surveys. Even in the 1970s, when things were getting a little hot and there was more people in favor of legalization than there had been in the past, it didn't really come close to where we are today, and I think that's a concern. Most of the public discussion on legalization, as you can see, comes from the fact that there's a big generational divide between those who support legalization and those who oppose it. And I think that's very worrisome, because frankly, we're losing Generation X and Y. So those that were born between 1965 and 2000. The majority of those folks think there should be legalization, and that number has been steadily going up over the last 10 years. I find that very concerning. The silent generation, those around 1935, et cetera, before that, they have consistently had lower support of legalization, but even they have shown an increase over the last 10 years. So there's some key demographics, especially young people, that we're really missing. And if we think about, going to the next slide, what issue and what factors have led to that increase, I think there are a couple things. I mean, one, of course, the anti-legalization folks have been outspent, and we've been hearing that for a very long time and talking about that. But I think there are a couple other things we don't talk about as much that, if we addressed, could actually get to the core of that problem. The first is what I would call the messenger problem, this generational familiarity, in that a lot of the folks who don't believe in what we're talking about with a balanced approach and fighting legalization, they are younger, and they hear the message of our message is often delivered by people that they do not relate with from a generation to generation. That's not, frankly, they're not their own age. They're not near their own age. And that has been a big, unfortunate aspect of this, is that there hasn't been enough younger people talking about a balanced approach and anti-legalization. I think that also the legalization groups frame their issue as a very sensible alternative to the current policy, that because current policy, quote unquote, isn't working, then therefore we need to legalize drugs. And they use terms like humanitarian, common sense, science-based, evidence-based, terms that actually the anti-legalization camp does not use as much, and that has been working. Clearly, when you look at the statistics, though, the facts are on the side of being against legalization, because legalization looks very risky when we think about the different aspects of it. First, marijuana is used at a far less rate than alcohol and tobacco, even though among youth, marijuana and tobacco in certain age groups have been, in fact, tobacco and cigarettes have been used more than marijuana in terms of surveys. Overall, the picture is still lopsided. Our legal drugs are used far more. We also know that this argument that if only we could tax marijuana, we would get some revenue that we could then use for prevention and treatment, we know that that argument is actually is pretty weak, because alcohol and tobacco each get about between $185 and $200 billion in lost social costs, yet they also only receive about $15 to $25 billion in revenues. So think about it. That's about a 10-to-1 ratio. So this idea that we're able to legalize marijuana and the attendant social costs aren't going to way go over the revenues, I think is a bit of a pipe dream, pardon the pun. Now, if we only treated it like alcohol, is also what we hear about the criminal justice system. Marijuana is putting everybody in jail, and so therefore, if we treated it like alcohol, we wouldn't have to arrest anybody, right? When's the last time you saw somebody being arrested for drinking beer? Well, the reality is that among the alcohol-related nonviolent arrests, so just arrests for say, public intoxication or any of the effects of higher alcohol use, like driving while intoxicated, those arrests come to about 2.7 million a year. We compare 2.7 million to the number of marijuana arrests, it's about 840,000 marijuana arrests. In fact, all drugs combined are about 1.1 million, less, or 1.6 million, about half as alcohol-related arrests alone. And that's simply because alcohol is used more, it's widely available and accepted, and therefore it's abused more. We also know that, and the RAND Corporation, a nonpartisan think tank, has shown that the price will drop. This was their analysis of California's proposition to legalize marijuana, that the price would drop more than 80%, and therefore consumption would increase. And this idea that we could get taxes from it, was difficult because they concluded that tax evasion with an underground marijuana market would be a major concern. So, we only need to look at the way the alcohol industry has behaved over the years as an example, and also the tobacco industry, to extrapolate what marijuana, legal marijuana, would look like. And, all of us have seen the alcohol ads that, the fine print underneath, it says, drink responsibly. And I chuckle when I see that drink responsibly tagline, because if the alcohol industry actually wanted us to drink responsibly, everybody who used alcohol, they would be out of business. They don't make any of their money from those people who drink responsibly. They make their money from the small number of very heavy users. So it's something like 70% of their income from about 10 to 15% of users. That is totally lopsided, and that's an incentive for heavy use. And this idea that legalization has been tried elsewhere, I think we need to be clear about it. First, no modern country has ever tried legalization. In fact, the U.S. did try it about 100 years ago, and there was the increases in cocaine and heroin, and that's why we have our anti-drug laws today. But in terms of today's drug policy, not even the Netherlands can claim that they have full legalization. They have something that's more like a de facto legalization, where they don't enforce their laws among a small group, among the coffee shops. And if you look within the Netherlands to look at what that has done, there's actually been a 2- to 3-fold increase in youth marijuana use from the time they really started commercializing it after it was legal to about 12 years after that. That was a RAND study between 84 and 96. They looked at that pivotal time. Portugal, other countries, there have been some increases, some decreases. Really depends on what year you look like. There's been some good research and some good commentary on the importance of really digging into these studies to make sure that it's well understood what they're saying, because a lot of people have misused them. Back to this issue that drug offenses, especially marijuana, as you can see, is crowding our prisons. We did a state-level analysis, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, from 2007, and they found that about 0.1% of offenders were marijuana only, with no prior arrests and no prior offenses. And if you look at those sentenced prisoners between 1985 to 2009 in terms of drug offenses were the initial reason why we saw the rise in incarceration in the U.S. in the 80s, no doubt about it, from mandatory minimums and harsh sentencing. But really, if you look actually over the last 10 years, from 2000, drug offenses have been plateauing while incarceration has been increasing. So there have been other reasons for this rise in incarceration. And, I think it's a worthy cause to reduce incarceration rates. That is something we should try and aim for. But we need to be very clear about the facts in terms of where drug offenses fall into that. It's also important to look at the underground market issue and crime. People have claimed that if only we legalize, we'll get rid of the black market. And again, RAND also, in light of the California proposition that did not pass, RAND did a report on Mexico's drug trafficking organizations. And they basically found that they earned about 15 to 25% of their revenue from marijuana, and they concluded that it was unlikely that legalization would either A, eliminate the black market for drugs, or B, get rid of drug trafficking organizations. It simply wouldn't happen. They're making their money from multiple things, not just marijuana, first of all. And secondly, there is no incentive for the underground market to disappear if there are high taxes that the state is imposing on these drugs. John Calkins in his class at Carnegie Mellon looked at the fact that taxes are necessary to prevent a price collapse. And there would have to be very high taxes, and these could create gray markets. On to the health effects of marijuana very quickly. I mean, we know that marijuana is not a benign drug, and that in fact 1 in 11 people who ever start using will become addicted. That's about the same rate as stimulants or analgesics, a little bit less than alcohol and cocaine, which are about 15 to 17%. And cigarettes are our most addictive drug, 1 in every 3 people. Heroin, 1 in every 4 people who ever start. But if you start in adolescence, researchers looked and found that marijuana addicts 1 in 6 adolescents who ever start using it. And that's not a trivial number, especially when you look at who's in treatment today and what drugs they're there for. And as you can see with this chart, the vast majority are there for marijuana. It's just so much more prevalent. Especially the fact there's been this increase between 1993 and 2007 with marijuana treatment admissions. And that's even when alcohol and cocaine have gone down, and heroin has stayed about the same. But marijuana has seen a more than doubling in treatment admissions. And if you think about why, especially over the last 15 years, actually, marijuana has been relatively stable. It's gone down in certain years, gone up in other years. When you look into why, then, is there so much increase in treatment, one of the reasons researchers have hypothesized is the fact that today's marijuana is not the marijuana of the past. It's much stronger. There are incentives, obviously, to make more potent marijuana to get more bang for your buck. They can sell it for a greater price. And that's been a big issue, is much more potent marijuana grown under very precise conditions to bring up the levels of THC. The final slides I'm going to talk about today is regarding this issue of medical marijuana. And we all know that medical marijuana is essentially voting on a medicine. It's bypassing this FDA process, which assures all sorts of things around safety and efficacy. And studies shown that have looked, we've had 15 years of medical marijuana so far. Studies have looked at who's actually using marijuana for so-called medical purposes. By and large, less than 5% for a chronic illness, for cancer, for HIV, and more than 80%, sort of the average person, is 18 to 32-year-old white male, history of alcohol and drug abuse, no history of a life-threatening illness like cancer or HIV. So I think it's important to look at who's actually using this drug. And of course, that doesn't mean that components in marijuana don't have medical properties. These are actually being scientifically developed as we speak, just like we have medical properties in opium, where where we have medicines derived from opium, even cocaine. But that's very different than allowing it to be in an outlet, without public health oversight and without going through proper trials. So, in fact, one such drug going through a proper drug trial right now that's really in the late stages is a drug called Sabet, which is essentially an oral mouth spray of 2 components in marijuana that are together in that mouth spray. And it's been approved throughout Europe and in Canada. That's an example of medical marijuana done right, in my opinion, and frankly in the opinion of the scientific community, as opposed to going somewhere with a 300-pound bouncer guarding a locked door with a neon sign at a place that only accepts cash. That seems a little suspect to me for medicine versus this process. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that there are no other ways to reduce incarceration. There are, and you can do so without legalizing drugs. You can do so going through a really balanced approach of prevention, treatment, recovery, smart enforcement, and international efforts. And I'm not going to go into those details today. But it's important to know that prevention does significantly reduce drug use, that treatment is cost-effective, people can and do recover, and there's reasons why we shouldn't stigmatize those that are in recovery, and frankly, that enforcement and treatment can work together. For example, in drug courts, things like Project Hope, things like the Drug Market Initiative, and other related things. So the future is uncertain about marijuana legalization. As you can see, there are a lot of different ways this can go. But I think it's really important, and I'll leave with this, that we do a couple of things. Recruit the younger generation into our field, go out of our way not to look inflexible with our policy, pick battles wisely, and really think like the future. As I say, think like Google, not Microsoft. Although Microsoft has a lot and has taught Google a lot. Google has paved the way for a whole new way that we look at a certain segment of an issue. And we should do that in drug policy. So I appreciate you listening to me. Go on my website, kevinsabet.com. Email me anytime. at Gmail, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.